When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that he was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and told the elders, saying,
I have sinned in betraying innocent blood.
It is not lawful to put them into the treasury, since they are blood money.
So they took counsel and brought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. Therefore that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken by the prophet Jeremiah, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him on whom a price had been set by some of the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him,
Are you the king of the Jews?
But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor wondered greatly. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them,
Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?
For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him,
Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much over him today in a dream.
Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor again said to them,
Which of the two do you want me to release for you?
and they said, Barabbas. Pilate said to them,
Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?
They all said, Let him be crucified. And he said,
Why? What evil has he done?
But they shouted all the more, Let him be crucified. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying,
I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves.
And all the people answered, Then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldier of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. And they spat upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. As they were marching out, they came upon a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. This man they compelled to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mingled with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. And they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, This is the Jesus, the King of the Jews. Then 2 robbers were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their tongues and saying, So also the chief priests with the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying,
He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him.
robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him the same way. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice.
Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani.
That is,
My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
and some of the bystanders, hearing it, said,
This man is falling flesh.
and one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said,
Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him.
and Jesus cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said,
Truly, this was the Son of God.
Gracious God, on this day when we celebrate both your magnificent and triumphant entry into Jerusalem and then the journey to the cross that also begins with that, help us to remember that you understand the contrasts and the vicissitudes in our lives as they change from day to day because of your own experience. Amen. So, I don't have any new stories to tell you about things my great nieces said, but I do have a Facebook picture to describe to you. My 4-year-old great nephew was supposed to be in bed and asleep, and his mom opened the door and checked on him and posted a Facebook picture because he had on his Buzz Lightyear mask, and he had on his Batman costume, and he had on arm guards from something else. He was a little bit of everything, laying awake in bed, playing with his toys. This is, I think, a little bit like Palm Sundays. It's a little bit of everything. It's really a study in contrasts because we start with this great celebration of the throngs of people gathering to praise Jesus, to welcome him as king into Jerusalem. And then a week later, they were saying the same things that we said today during the reading. Let him be crucified. Let him be crucified. How quickly things change. Jesus really, I don't know how he had the fortitude to sustain the oddity of that week. And let me tell you that it was difficult even before this, because you heard that they were approaching Bethphage, they were by Jerusalem in the opening reading today. They'd been walking toward Jerusalem for several days, and Jesus had been walking with his disciples in Matthew 20, right before the reading we read this morning, and he was telling them, I'm going to be put to death. I'm going to die, but I will rise from the dead. Matthew tells us that Jesus was crystal clear about all that with his disciples. So they listened to this, and guess what happened next? The mother of James and John, 2 of the disciples, came to Jesus right after this and said, Jesus, I have kind of a favor to ask of you. Jesus probably said, okay. And she said, when you get into heaven, I want you to arrange it so my son James sits on one side of you at your throne and my son John sits at the other side of you at your throne. They didn't get it. Even in the middle of Jesus' crystal clear explanation, even in the middle of all the times that he's talked to them about what's going to happen with the end of his life, They don't understand it. And it's easy to figure out why, because they came then to Jerusalem, and Jesus is welcomed triumphantly, and the disciples had to have thought, oh, this is going to go a lot better than Jesus was expecting it to. We're going to have a pretty good week here, probably, right? Only they didn't. The crowd turned just like that. The contrast is stark from praise to calling for his murder in just a few days. And the whole thing is covered in contrast. Because in the reading in Philippians, we learn that Jesus, who was God, Paul tells us, didn't consider staying God, staying infinite and eternal, to be something to be held on to, but he was willing to give up his godness, that infinitude, and come to earth as a human being, as a servant to the disciples, from being that great God to being human. Now, to be sure, in his human form, Jesus was still fully God. He didn't give up his godness, but he gave up that infinity, and he limited himself to one of our human frail bodies. I think about Jesus walking along and saying to one of his disciples, man, I think I'm getting a blister. God doesn't get blisters, but Jesus almost certainly did, right? Jesus probably walked and told jokes. And when his friend Lazarus died, he cried. Jesus took on all of that humanity because he wasn't grasping at being God. He was willing to let it down. Jesus went from palms to passion. We do that in this service, and it feels a little jarring, doesn't it? We move very quickly from that waving palm branches to hearing the texts that John and Jan read so beautifully for us of Jesus being sentenced to death and hanged on a cross. And in real life, it happened fast. That contrast is stark, and we're supposed to notice it. Jesus went from being worshiped to being murdered. So what does this mean for us? Well, I'm getting ready to have my knee replaced, both my knees replaced. I have to tell you, I'm a little anxious. I'm not so anxious about the things that you might think I would worry about, like the pain. Well, okay, I'm worrying about the pain and the rehab. Here's what I'm really laying awake at night worrying about. I'm not making this up. That when I'm coming out of the anesthesia and my surgeon comes in to say, how are you? That I'm going to say something like, you're the cutest little tiny man I've ever seen. Right? He's so cute, but he's just teeny. I think they must put the surgical cot on the floor. I'm sorry. Was that inappropriate? But we all have things that keep us awake at night and that worry us, right? And sometimes they're really stupid things, like the one I just described. But often they're not. Our lives, like Jesus's, can turn on a dime, can't they? Life can go from being great and everything being wonderful and having peace to a diagnosis that's earth-shattering, or the loss of a friend that breaks your heart, or the loss of a job, or, our lives can change in an instant. And what Palm Sunday and then the crucifixion teach us is that Jesus fully understands when our lives turn, because his turned too. He gets when we are crying or when we are laughing from relief, when we are brokenhearted with our own brokenness or the pain of other people's brokenness. Jesus understands when we cry about that. Jesus understands when we feel like our lives are ending from the pain of living. Wednesday night in our Wednesday night drama, you guys, by the way, if you were here at the earlier service, that was about the end of the first service sermon. But since we aren't up against another service, I'm going to keep talking. Wednesday night, we had the drama, our Wednesday night dramas, and Jesus was on the cross, and Satan, or the devil, was tempting him to come down from the cross. You can come down from the cross. And Jesus doesn't, of course, come down from the cross, and at the very end, those of you who were here heard the poignancy of the devil's cry, I've lost, I've lost. And then she, because it was played by a woman, said, I don't know what kept him on that cross. They were only spikes. And he could have gotten them out of his hands at any time. What kept him up there? And then she looked out at us and she said, it was you. It was his love for you. That's what kept Jesus up. And our love for Jesus and our love for one another is what keeps us going in painful and wretched situations. It's what reminds us that Jesus is always with us in those moments. We are not alone. When our lives move in a contrast like this, God understands. You have a God who understands the complexity and the joys and the sorrows of your life, who understands the parts that are hard and painful and walks with you and won't ever abandon you. This is what this week means. God understands and is with us. So here's what I'd like you to do this week. As we go through these services, from Palm Sunday through Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and then Easter, I'd like you to think about letting yourself sink deeply into the experience of these days. Let yourself understand the sorrow of God the Father at the death of his Son. Let your heart understand the pain of Jesus' heart when the crowd turned against him, when all he had done was be kind and healing and loving. Because in letting yourself sink down into that, you will be able, a week from today, to rise in glorious celebration for the resurrection, fully prepared for that feast day. Amen.